Thank you so much, and thank you again to the Asan Plenum, Asan Forum for inviting me again to the Asan Plenum. It's been very intellectually stimulating. And this morning, as we had the first opening plenary session, I was thinking about how there were all Western voices that were up here, and how much I was looking forward to this session, so we could hear more, particularly Chinese, Russian, but other perspectives on the illiberal international order. We were given a brief description of this session before arriving, and it says in the description that China and Russia are offering alternative models of development. It's been very interesting to me, as somebody who follows China, to listen to the evolution of Chinese officials and analysts talking about the international order. Xi Jinping, of course, at the 19th Party Congress, he talked about China's development model, in particular, as being an option for developing countries to consider going forward. But nevertheless, Chinese officials still tell us, and analysts, that Beijing is not seeking to overturn the international order. I would emphasize, however, that for China, the international order, and I think probably for Russia as well, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, it is the institutions that comprise it that they are really committed to. It is not so much the values and the norms that underpin that order. So one of the questions that I hope that some of the panelists will address is whether China and Russia are presenting a new model of development and a new international order, whether China and Russia agree on what this new international order should be. And I'd ask each of you to talk a bit about what you see as your country's vision for the international order. If we take as a given, Hugh White in the prior panel said, we're not going to be able to defend the existing international order, we're going to be creating a new one. Then what is your country's vision for the international order? So with those introductory remarks, we're going to turn to each of our panelists, and I've asked them to please limit their remarks to a maximum of 10 minutes, and if it's a little less, that's okay too. And we're going to start to my left with Professor Kim Taehwan, who is Associate Professor of Public Diplomacy of the Korea National Diplomatic Academy in the Republic of Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So please, Professor Kim.
Well, thank you very much, Bunny. Well, I should say that in the start, make it very clear that I'm being misplaced. Well, actually, I today brought with the notion of sharp power, but then belatedly tomorrow this morning, I mean, today this morning, I found that there's a separate panel scheduled this evening on the topic of sharp power. But then my intention is I actually assess the challenges posed by China and Russia. Illiberal challenges, if you like, illiberal challenges posed by Russia and China through the prism of the notion and also practices of sharp power, what they call sharp power. Sharp power is very fresh concept, which is, to my understanding, first introduced in last December in a report by National Endowment for Democracy, and then could be probably roughly defined as the ability to affect others to obtain the outcomes you want, but not through attraction. If that is the case, then it's soft power, not sharp power, but through mostly not attraction, but distraction, disinformation, and or manipulation of information. And in many cases, the ultimate goal of sharp power is not to win the hearts and minds of foreign publics, but distract them, relying in many cases, some non-transparent, covert, some illegitimate, if not outright illegal method. That's, I mean, rough definition of sharp power. But then I know that it's we need some, further polishing of the notion in the coming, years. So what I'm going to do today is the first is I just want to present a couple points in comparing different types of Russian and Chinese way of exercising what they call so-called, sharp power. And then finally, I'm going to get to some challenges posed by Russia and China. So some comparative points. The first point is actually what actually do they want to disseminate? What are their messages? What do they want to propagate? What messages do they want to propagate across the government? I think it's very important that the messages, or what I rather prefer to call it, discourses or strategic narratives. Okay? So, I mean, strategic narratives in itself is a distinctive type of soft power, I would argue. It's particularly a communicative power, which is very important in the era of information and technological revolution in this century. The first point of reference is so the China, the strategic narrative of China, composed of roughly two elements. The first one is, of course, the President Xi Jinping's vision of China Dream, okay, the rejuvenation of the great Chinese nation. And the second element is some traditional, classic Chinese philosophical elements, including Confucianism. So, roughly said that it actually presents a very Sinocentric worldview and very Sinocentric values. And by the year roughly like 2050, China would get close to the historical right place. I mean, the center place of the international society, meaning that it means that it's China's great power aspiration. Russia, again, two elements. The first one is Eurasianism. I just don't want to go in detail into the notion of Eurasianism. Simply put it, I mean, there are different versions of Eurasianism, but simply put it, it's a Eurasian space as an independent civilization vis-a-vis West European or Atlantic civilization and vis-a-vis Asian civilization. And they believe that there is some kind of a pan-Eurasian collective identity and some confrontational relationship between the Atlanticism and Eurasianism. So the Russia particularly provides Eurasian civilization values as an alternative. The second element, more specifically, the second components of Russian narrative include traditional values, conservative values with the key notions of family, nation, and Christianity. So roughly the narrative Russian narrative says that Russia identifies herself as a besieged fortress surrounded by the corrupt and decadent Western capitalism, Western civilization, sort of like a meta-narrative. The second point of reference is intentions and goals of their sharp power, or could be soft power. China is in the international arena, is more concerned with controlling the discussions of what they call sensitive issues, which include, such issues as Tiananmen, Xinjiang, Falun Gong, human rights, the Dalai Lama, okay? And then also, no less is concerned with justifying the Communist Party's rule in mainland China. Whereas the Russia's intention is more focused on discrediting Western political and economic systems and values institutions and amplifying the local host countries' internal divisions and finally providing alternatives, their own alternatives. Means and assets, what kind of means assets? This is very confusing because, you know, when we get to the realm of means and assets, it's really hard to tell sharp power from soft power because they utilize almost like a similar means, meaning that media assets, diaspora, cultural assets. In the case of China, for example, Confucian Institute. In the case of Russia, for example, Ruski Mir. And also, all those like soft power assets combined with direct and indirect political pressures on cooptations. I just make 2 points to be noted at the risk of oversimplification. Comparing those two, patterns, the first one is the boundaries between soft and hard power really blurred. And in practice, these countries, I mean, China and Russia, they actually mingling all different types of power, soft power, sharp power, and even hard power. And the second point I would like to make is soft and hard power are relative notions. What do I mean? What one sees sharp power, the other considers actually soft power. So what does that mean? From the perspective of China and Russia, the liberal soft power, such as democracy, human rights, could be a mal-intentioned, malign sharp power, which possibly could pose a threat to their internal regime and stability of society, and vice versa. So we have here very relative notions of, I mean, it could be both sharp and soft power depending on your perspectives. Okay? This is, I think, is a very important point. Finally, a couple challenges. Of course, when China and Russia continue to propagate, illiberal alternatives and expand their influence, the liberal international order would face a serious revisionist challenges. But then my point is that we cannot blame Russia or China simply for the fact that their proposed values, their proposed ideas are different from liberalism. Okay? They both could be sharp power or soft power. So what is to be done to counter the so-called value, China's and Russia's value-based offensive? I think the first task we have to do is look back into ourselves and rectify the inner drawbacks of the liberal international order. What actually we have to contemplate and also act on what went wrong with liberalism, particularly since the triumphant 1990s. And the second point is related to the first one, is the issue of what I call exclusionary versus inclusionary identity politics. I mean, being different in their values and worldviews should not necessarily make them, enemies, arch enemies. If that is the case, then we could hardly avoid another round of clash of identities, clash of values, clash of ideas, if not clash of civilizations. So the thing we have to keep in mind is, first of all, how to transform the exclusionary identity politics into inclusionary identity politics. So first of all, by recognizing the differences and trying to reconcile the differences by devising, coexistence mechanisms. And the last but not least, the real crucial difference between sharp and soft power lies not in substance, I mean, the messages or values, narratives themselves, but the method, the way in which the narratives are propagated. As I said in the beginning, they're using, covert and non-transparent and non-legitimate method. And I think this is the realm we have to take as strong as possible measures, whether it might be, legal measures or whether it might be a proactive measures to counter the disinformation campaign. I think I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Our next panelist is Professor Alexander Lukin, Director of the Center for East Asian and Shanghai Cooperation Organization Studies at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. Well, forget about soft power. In Russia, we usually use hard power. Well, I'm a bit uncomfortable about the topic of our discussion, liberal order, or a liberal order, because I think that so-called liberal order never existed. It's kind of utopian ideal of Western ideologies. And what really existed? President Ham, in today's opening words, divided countries into pre-liberal, liberal, and post-liberal. I think it's a good example of the fact that Korea, despite being an Asian country, is dominated by the West, not only from the point of view of security, but also intellectually. Because it's a good example of usual Western, I would say, a post-enlightenment theory of progress, one-line progress. We had, maybe you remember that Hegel thought that the ideal society was his contemporary Prussian state, and all the societies moved in that direction. Well, Karl Marx saw the communist ideal, which was, by the way, not people remember, was based on economic achievements of the developed Western, especially European countries. So now we are talking about liberalism or liberal order, which is another version of Western dominated order. By the West, I mean the United States and its allies, political West. Not from that point of view, Korea is probably part of the West, as I said, while Serbia is not yet. So I remember one of the speakers today, I think it was Professor Kupchan, said, which was very interesting, I think, that the basis of the liberal order was the British Empire, and then Pax Americana, which emerged from the British Empire. But he forgot to say that the British Empire was a colonial empire. And at that time, they called themselves civilized countries and others savages, as far as I remember. Before, Greeks called other countries which were not civilized barbarian. And now some people call them pre-liberal. Well, and during the colonial time, of course, all these people whom I mentioned, they had good intentions. They helped other non-developed savage nations. Well, sometimes like during the colonialism with bayonets and cannons, sometimes with intellectual achievements, and it depended on the circumstances. But what if I don't want to be a savage, or I don't see myself as a savage and a barbarian? Maybe I see the whole situation, the world system a bit differently. Well, I think that the problem now with the international system is not the fact that the liberal order is disappearing or is in danger, but that the Western domination is getting weaker. The Western domination, which was there at least from the colonial times, but maybe even earlier, and that domination was based on advanced weapons, advanced technology, and advanced, mostly military organization. Now is the period when all this, or most of this technology, weapons and military organization are also available to other growing former savages, let's say, or former colonies. And this is the objective basis objective basis of the changes in the international order. So it is the Western-dominated world which is disappearing. And what is emerging is what we call, or some scholars in Russia and China call multipolar world, which means that other centers of power, non-Western centers of power are growing, and they are sometimes even more effective economically, like some countries like China, for example, than the Western part. In a perfect multipolar world, centers of power would probably keep equal distance from each other. But because now, the contemporary period, we see that first the Western world is still the most, the strongest one, and also the US and its allies try aggressively to protect its position, its dominating position, and to turn history back. This is the reason why other centers of power have to cooperate closely than they would have in an ideal multipolar world. So, and this is the basis of Russian-Chinese cooperation. And not only Russian-Chinese cooperation, we are talking today about Russia and China, but cooperation between other, or among other non-Western countries. And this is the source of the development of the BRICS, for example, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Eurasian Economic Union, and other non-Western organizations and groups. So Russia and China cooperate closely because we see the world similarly. We stand for multipolar world. We support its emergence. Our approaches to regional conflicts also coincide. That's why we vote mostly together in the Security Council. Well, President Trump also assumed that Russia and China, first he assumed that they were not civilized. Well, once he used, recently used words that Russia and China were dangerous or a challenge to the civilized world. This is an interesting idea to hear it from a president of a country which has only 300 years of history and very interesting culture. But he also called, as well as some scholars in the West, Russia and China revisionist countries towards the so-called liberal world. Well, I would say that it is the United States which are a revisionist power in contemporary world, not Russia and China, because Russia and China stand for preserving, for maintaining the real world order that existed or was created after the Second World War. It's Russia and China that support the dominant role of the Security Council of the United Nations. And it was the United States and its allies who undermined the system, who, you know, unilaterally, beginning from Bush the Jr., used force without without the decision of the Security Council. Maybe you remember that even the Korean War was officially sanctioned by the Security Council. Actions in Serbia were also formally sanctioned by the Security Council. But after that, Bush decided to go alone without the support of the Security Council, so it was the United States who broke the system. So why would the United States ask questions about if they go alone, why shouldn't others not go alone? So the current period, as I see it, is the period of West's, say, adjustments to the new situation, when it has to develop a concept of equal relationship, which it doesn't have. That there are some countries which, in the world, that it cannot do anything about, and that it has to somehow take into consideration their point of view. But it's not, it's unlikely to understand it from what I see in the West. It's unlikely to understand it in the foreseeable future. So this period is very dangerous. For example, we always hear that Russia, China, or any other country should not have its sphere of influence, that countries should be free, all countries, small countries in the world should be free to choose alliances and so on. But from the point of view of non-Western world, this is actually a demand that the West should have the entire world as its own sphere of influence. And others should not have their interests at all. So, as I said, this is a dangerous period. Of course, there could be a solution, some kind of new arrangement, let's say like Helsinki Agreement, but between many centers of power, and a new set of rules of how to behave. But I don't think that the United States, and from that point of view, whether it's Trump or non-Trump, it doesn't matter, it's not going to agree in the foreseeable future on that. So we may be up to a new war if this tendency continues. The problem now, and the danger now, is that historically, all international arrangements and all new international systems, were negotiated between countries after a devastating war, beginning from the Westphalian system, after First World War, after Second World War. But now we have a situation when we have new generations in many countries of leaders who forgot about the dangers of war, how wars really looked like. Well, who was the last American president who actually fought during the war? I think it was Bush the Senior. The same is in Russia. So for them, a war, a new nuclear war, is a very kind of academic question. And there are more and more, we often hear talk now that a limited nuclear strike may be not that devastating, that proliferation of nuclear weapons is not that bad. And this creates a psychologically very dangerous atmosphere. Well, I hope, of course, that we are going to overcome these problems. But as a realist, I'm quite pessimistic. Thank you. I'm going to stop here.
Very sobering analysis there, Sasha. Okay.
Are you sure?
Next, we turn to Dr. Overholt, who's a senior fellow.
It's only 4 o'clock.
at Harvard University's Asia Center, please.
Thank you. Thanks to the Asan Institute for creating this wonderful conference. I appreciate the invitation. I'm asked to explain in 10 minutes why Russia and China have not enthusiastically accepted the market democracy and American leadership. I have to oversimplify a little bit. I apologize for that. To start with Russia, if you look at Russia's introduction to market democracy and the Western system, the strategy was called shock therapy. It was one of the greatest shocks, in fact, one of the greatest human rights abuses in modern history. GDP declined by 40%. Many groups experienced much, much worse than that. It was a horrible, horrible experience that discredited Western ideas about the market and about democracy. Another part of the strategy was to distribute all the state assets, the shares of the state companies, to a population that had no means of valuing them, none of the institutions in the West that ensure fair trading and public understanding of what is going on. So it wasn't surprising that the shares, the valuable shares, ended up in the hands of a handful of multi-billionaires who actually knew how to value them and how to work the system. That in turn led to a tremendous public desire for a strong man who would get the billionaires under control and restore order to the system. And that strong man was Putin. Putin is the child of Yeltsin and Jeffrey Sachs. Yes, illegitimate. Professor Lucan says correctly. This was a very humiliating experience. That humiliation probably would have induced some kind of reaction. But the humiliation was maximized by the Western extension of NATO right up to the Russian borders against explicit promises that the U.S. had made. So democracy was discredited, market economy was discredited, and collaboration with the US-led system was discredited. The story is not over yet. Putin is making the same mistakes as his Soviet predecessors. He's not creating an efficient economy. He's over-investing in the military at the expense of the economy. He has not institutionalized his regime. The most likely outcome of Putinism is that Russia becomes a kind of crippled quarry for that provides resources to China and Germany. We may get a reaction within Russia against that. How about China? Here too, I think if you look at the development model, you gain an understanding. Under Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, there were frenetic market reforms. Zhu Rongji laid off 45 million manufacturing workers in 10 years and transferred them to the services economy. He tried to with some success, to cut the government in half. Can you imagine Ronald Reagan trying to cut the U.S. government in half? Bipartisan outrage. And the public was just totally stressed out. The last 18 months of Zhu Rongji, people hated him. He's back to being a hero, which is the right evaluation, but at the time he was hated. And in came a leadership that promised a harmonious society under Hu Jintao. And harmonious society meant many things on many levels, but above all it meant no more Zhu Rongji stressful market reforms. You ended up with a somnolent era under a weak leader, a Politburo Standing Committee that operated much like the US Supreme Court, very judicious but very slow. And after a few years, people just got worried. The center seemed to them to be losing control. The provincial governments were going their own way. The huge interest groups were asserting themselves. One was the petroleum faction. Trillions of dollars, managing trillions of dollars of energy resources and arbitraging corruptly the difference between official prices and market prices, led by a member of the Politburo Standing Committee who was China's overall chief of security. To get this under control and to impose economic reforms that would damage the interests of every power group in society, they felt they had to centralize power. The situation was getting a little bit desperate. And so they made these decisions to cut the Politburo Standing Committee from 9 to 7, to cut out the extremes of opinion from that committee, to create all sorts of small leading groups and put one guy in charge of all of them, to give the new guy immediate leadership of the military. All these were consensus decisions before Xi Jinping took power, based on a sense of national crisis. To deal with the crisis, they came up with an economic theory based on market allocation of resources. Probably the most brilliantly analyzed economic plan in world history. But politics has gotten in the way of implementing it. They smashed these interest groups using the anti-corruption campaign, but then everybody got scared and didn't want to implement reforms. If I implement a reform, it may make you angry. And if you get angry, you're going to say I'm corrupt, and I probably am. So I'm feeling very vulnerable. I'm just going to hide under the table. So reform has been very slow. And the need for political control has conflicted with the idea of market allocation of resources. We're told that enterprises will be put on a market basis, including the state enterprises. But the party committee inside every enterprise, including private enterprises, is going to have more power in the future. And we're going to have the rule of law, but the party commission that actually decides the verdicts in the courts is going to be strengthened. So, tremendous tension between resolving the political problem and resolving the economic problem. So you have a regime that's desperate to crack down, much more fearful than the highly composed, perfectly coiffed images you see on television. Meanwhile, internationally, the 2008 financial crisis has discredited much of the Western economic model in Chinese eyes. Trump and Brexit have discredited much of the political model. U.S. military containment, which is very assertive and often very provocative, has contributed to China's sense that it needs to assert itself. Obviously, some of that sense of need to assert itself would have been there anyway. So that's how we got to today. Looking toward the future, I would emphasize that political complexity that comes with this kind of economic success. I've just published a book called China's Crisis of Success. Success brings this tremendous political complexity of powerful interest groups. The forces here are relentless. China will have to deal with them one day. It's got two problems. It's got to make the political control and the economic reform consistent with each other. And it's got to deal with the problem of political complexity. This is where Taiwan and South Korea were around 1979 and 1980. You have a financial squeeze, emerging problems of the big enterprises, and a new kind of politics. And China's got a great theory on the economic side, but the politics will have to be dealt with. People at the top of the Chinese government understand this. Chinese intellectuals understand this. They call it connecting the party with the people. The idea in Washington that's become so common that China has settled into one-man rule with rapid growth for the indefinite future is completely wrong. First of all, it isn't one-man rule. Xi Jinping is not Putin. Xi Jinping is a creature of the party. Putin's party is a creature of Putin. It's totally different. And trying to go with this extremely authoritarian model will have economic costs. So the Chinese story continues to evolve, and it's unfortunate if U.S. policies change dramatically based on a kind of caricature that doesn't realize the dynamic forces.
Great, thank you very much. Our next panelist, Ambassador, I'm going to try this, Sikharulidze.
Very good.
Am I close?
Yeah.
Okay.
Excellent.
Former Minister of Defense of Georgia and former Ambassador to the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So I look forward to your remarks, please.
Thank you. It's difficult to speak on the panel with China, US, and Russia, given the size of my country, but I would say that we've been attacked, hacked, and subverted before it was cool by Russia. So let me start by saying that many people, many panelists today mentioned Fukuyama and his end of history. So yes, actually, decade later, when end of history was declared, we saw the rise of Russian revisionism that coincided with some kind of decline in a sense of solidarity in the free world. and decay of a vision and coherent strategy for a future of the free world. And it's grown in size during the time when US has become more inward-looking. And, well, there were also some attempts to, after some attempts of, to accommodate the partially how Russia sees their grievances after the fall of Soviet Union. And this was one of the first, it was first open declaration by President Putin that this beginning of the revisionism policies, when he declared that the breakup of Soviet Union was the largest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. It's very interesting. Not First World War, not rise of Nazism, not Second World War, not really the terrible Soviet communist regime that took more than 40 million lives. But the greatest tragedy or greatest catastrophe is a breakup of Soviet Union. I think, well, my European colleagues and Joe and many of those that lived in Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc agreed that it was the source to rejoice when the Soviet Union came down, and then about 300 million people got the freedom from communist rule, including Russians too. However, I think that there was a problem of consolidating this rule, and then we saw this rise of this revisionism. I think that there were many justifications brought around, so-called what's they stand for? Well, what's the new Russian regime stands for? It's was Slavianism first, and then Eurasianism, Russian world. Well, probably not really all those countries that are experiencing this attack on themselves in different ways, starting from the hard power, going through the economic power, and then the soft power, are not all of them are fitting under any of this. And then in my opinion, I don't think that any of those concepts are really serious concepts. I think that one of the main reasons what is Kremlin trying to achieve through the hybrid war, it is waging over the free world, and then started with its neighbors, but it well, expanded further and then beyond, is the consolidation of power at home and the sustainment of the regime, the corrupt regime that is now in power. And for those reasons, they need to create the enemy outside. And then I don't know, and I think that US or the free world is the good image of enemy, so I think that then this has been the case all over there. If you look on the Russian propaganda, it's full of the image of enemy outside that is trying to bring Russia on the knees again. And this expansion has been brought as a national idea, and then it's heavily really embraced by media. Well, it's a kind of different type of regime. Now we are seeing even communist regime was run by actually the politicians, even in a specific way, so politicians in a specific way. Current regime is mostly composed of the former KGB operatives that, and then specifically what they are doing is that they are, well, there is the lack of the grand strategy for the development of Russia, in my opinion, as I see it. It's, and then there are the really very specific attention, enormous attention to the operations and constant tactical gains, one after another, and then solidifying these gains after every step. And use of all components of the state power, military, paramilitary, special services, cyber, energy, financial, information operations. Mostly these operations are focused on, not on, well, on bringing chaos, distrust within the society, polarization among society. And I think that they are also see that the authoritarian regime's comparative advantages over the free world and the free democracies. And then they are, well, the Russian the Russian tactic, hybrid war tactic, is trying to capitalize as much as possible on this. Another component of state power, I think that it's very difficult, only for the academic purposes we can speak of differentiation of the soft, economic, as our friend Joseph Nye would put it, and the hard power. I think that there are very blurry boundaries between them. And I think, one of the most important things that today is driving this destructive, confusing, polarizing policies are that, the nature of regime. So Hudson Institute recently, Hudson Institute Kleptocracy Initiative recently released the document that study on kleptocracy, and then they say, this study clearly says that the corruption in general is very widely used to maintain power at home and then expand this power, or expand the influence outside the country. So I think that Georgia, my country, as well as many other countries, have experienced it. And the traditional sources of state power are the coercion, occupation, subversion, inserting agents of influence in the political elite and society. All these have been experienced in Georgia, in my country, and then I bet in many other countries. So those are all those components of fighting the hybrid war with the clear aim that the objective is not actually to some, as we see it, it's what are the end goals? End goals are to distract, confuse, polarize, seed the nihilism, and then also through this actually distract countries from its development and its free choice of how they would like to continue and then live in their lives. This constant struggle for expanding spheres of influence through undermining stability and development of other nations seems the only way of existence of such a totalitarian kleptocratic regime. And if it's uncontained, this regime can continue to generate new centers for instability, as well as the support and stimulate rise of authoritarian and totalitarian dictatorships worldwide. And we saw first, I don't know how to say it, actually from the immediate neighborhood, we saw this expansion of these operations far away from Russia. One thing is one point I'd like to make here is that then I hear it more and more, and I would like to say that the democracies have serious issues, internal issues, problems. They make mistakes, and sometimes big ones. Emerging democracies such as Georgia have even more serious issues within their societies or in the international relations. And all these issues must be addressed, and it's up to democracies to address them. However, putting a moral equality mark between actions and intentions of democracies and totalitarian regimes, and seeing world affairs as only strategic clash of two competing systems is misleading and confusing narrative. After all its struggle for freedom and for, we can see that this narrative sometimes penetrates into the free systems as well. I don't know. I just like to reiterate on the issue of humiliation or the grievances Russia had. It's really difficult to understand for Russian neighbors what does it mean when we are talking about the humiliation or the grievances after the fall of this so-called evil empire. Empire is gone, evil is pretty much there, but I don't think that the giving the choice to nations to choose their own way of development is it can be the source of humiliation of someone. Or the expansion of NATO, for example. The promise of NATO expansion has been broken, we can hear very frequently. Well, I've seen myself about 3 studies. One study, by the way, one study made by CSIS as well. And all these 3 studies, we are trying to find piece of paper or the witness, whoever promised anybody in Russia not to expand NATO. That no such paper was found, no such witness was found. I saw in the CSIS papers there is even Gorbachev's interview speaking about this, and I think that that's kind of a product of this Russian propaganda. And I think that free world has all rights to go back to the moral assertiveness, and I think it's time to go there. Another thing is defense capabilities, and defense capabilities even there was even after declaration of end of history, defense capabilities matter, still matter, and then nations should be more serious about spending on defense. And in this case, it's there were a lot of noise around President Trump's statements on the 2% of growth. But as I remember, it's been an issue between allies since Clinton administration, if not before. And my last point is about U.S. leadership and why U.S. leadership is important. And I think it's not only important, but it's essential. It's essential because no any other nation is able or willing to lead free world. Of course, those that chosen a different way of their development could be they cannot recognize this leadership. But there is also another issue that I think that should come back. So the U.S. is the only country that defines its national interests far beyond its immediate political or economic or some kind of other needs. And it's been a case from Truman administration all the way to George W. Bush administration. And I think that those 2 components are really important for the free world and for U.S. leadership. Whether U.S. is willing to lead now, this is a big question. I think yes. My answer on this question, yes, even though I heard many doubts on this. But I still believe that the free world can prevail and we can go back to a liberal order, and U.S. leadership is absolutely necessary for this.
Thank you, Ambassador. Our last speaker, Feng, who is Executive Director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea at Nanjing University, as well as Director of the Institute of International Studies. Feng?
Okay, thanks, Bonnie. So I will be getting relatively brief because I think we could have more time to have a Q&A. First of all, from the Chinese perspective, we consider we are totally full hearts. We say, how to put it this words, is a cooperator to liberal international order. Because in the past 3 decades, it's just due to the China's rise and the growth. Then say the global prosperity is truly thriving, is truly extending. Then if you look at some sort of domestic implications of China's integrating itself into the world, then the result is also very, very encouraging. So today, yes, Xi's administration bring about some sort of tentative back down of China's domestic politics. But personally, I totally believe it's a tentative, because no one can pull China down. The reason is today's China's re-emergency very, very luckily happened under the two conditions. One is globalization, second is digitalization. So even the China's domestic politics is really a little bit turning inward looking. Then we will see the number of the Chinese international tourists is hiking. How many Chinese visit the US every year now? More than 7 million. How many Chinese visit Japan? 8 million. How many Chinese visit Korea? 7 million. So then that kind of global access really just enable the Chinese fully exposure to the world. Then, as I mentioned, no one can pull China back. It's one thing. Second condition is digitalization. Yes, censorship is going very, very rampant, but we have a lot of VPN-based, we say, cross-firewall actions. It's very popular among the youngsters. So then today, I don't think the liberal international order will be under any, we say, threat with the Chinese rise. Instead, I think some sort of integration between the China and this order also will become a very, very positive driving force to keep the Chinese domestic politics rolling forward. But the problem is how the liberal international order could be accommodative to a rising power. It's a big question mark. Now you know the Trump, President Trump. He keeps China hammering and always say China abused some sort of international trade norm, China stealing Americans' intellectual property rights, then China also, cheating or stealing. Come on. If you're looking back past the 2.5 decades, every year, US government just keep China on serious scrutiny. So there's never ending, we say, of some sort of a trade economic-based frictions. Back to 1994, then there will be MFN-driven friction. Back to the end of the 90s, then there's a lot of American pressure on China's, we say, some sort of market access. Then after this century, then we see a lot of the Americans push on China's protection of international property rights. But now Trump say his predecessors stupid and also doing the waste of the time's job. So it's the China's cheating. We can't take it that right. What's today's Trump's United States? Very selfish, very economically nationalist. I'm just trying to use this evidence to tell you how illuminating liberal international order will not be just resting on Americans' hegemony. So to be a professor of international relations, the international order is the consequence of international redistribution of the power. So the stability by nature, any international order should be based on one is a value promotion, the second is well-balanced power structure. So such a real nature of international order has little to do what kind of a rabbling you just offer. It's liberal or illiberal. And it has much more to do with what? With a very sophisticated, well-balanced redistribution of power. I have to say, with China's emergence, then such a system, international system, could be first time since the end of the Cold War, well rebalanced. If the US is not balanced, US will lead to the abuse of power. We see a lot of cases. Today, then we will see why the Middle East could just sliding into the pieces. It's a color revolution. US and Europe initiated color revolution, but left a lot of a mess. They don't want to clean it. Then we look at Afghanistan. After some sort of, for more than 1 decade, Afghanistan Wars, Afghanistan is also getting eased on with the extremist Islamic thoughts and force? No. Then my friend Professor Lukin also mentioned the Ukraine issue. I think the Ukraine has a very intimate relations with Russia, almost in all terms. We say demographically, culturally, and even geopolitically. Why not? NATO and the United States always just squeeze Russia into the corner and denying some sort of very, very primary power respect that Moscow always call on for their relations with what? With Ukraine. Then we also know back to the middle of the 90s, it's NATO's eastward expansion keep Russia cornered. Now today's President Putin's Russia is what? A liberal order? Really welcome? We also know the action always more powerful than the words. Today, it's also high time for us to just re-pick up this, we say, some sort of proverb. So the stability and the continuity of a liberal international order does not overwhelmingly depends on how we aspiring to what? To the value motion. Then such a sustainability and the stability of the order really, really rests on how we can converge, how we can respect, how some sort of, we say, redistribution of power could be benefit this kind of the continuity of the liberal international order. China also needs the balance. So then with the China's rise, US hitting back, the Japan is the more proactive in defense. Then we will see the Korea also raise the US vigil against the China. I consider they are all natural and spontaneous. But the problem is, my question, the Western-centered liberal international order also needs a balance. My answer is absolutely yes, it is. So then, don't take the liberal international order as some sort of, we say, fatalism of Western centralist power system. That will be misleading. Then we can take the liberal international order as absolutist, we say, some sort of endorsement for all the powers could play their role expectedly. If we can move that way, the liberal international order will always showing its vitality. Today, conclusively, China is become not just the beneficiary to the liberal international order. Then I also see the Beijing, whoever you just naming the Chinese leader, is more receptive to liberal international order. If you read through the 90-party Congress report, you know what's the wording? The central governments of Beijing just use in describing the China's relations with this Western-dominated international order. It say, yes, we're a beneficiary. Second, we're a constructor. The third is we're a contributor. So previously, every time Beijing outlined its international vision, there is a central piece always just repeated once again. That means China is calling on construction of the new, fair international political economic order. But such a word is totally diminished out of the Chinese political vocabulary. So we are now very confidently declare China is part of this order, China is constructor. But my question is, how accommodative this system or this order will be? So then we can just still keep watching, but the problem is, my suggestion is, future's international, liberal international order is not just, always targeting China or Russia. Yes, China and Russia probably, and of course it's certainly a liberal democracy, but we're still beneficiary, we're still constructor, we're still some sort of, we say, important, we say, latecomer to this order. But the problem is, don't just gauge this order. It's a very, we say, naturally sit at the opposite to China and then Russia. That probably is a very important way we should just move forward. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Feng, and the rest of our speakers. I'll just make one very brief comment on China, a rhetorical comment, though if you wish you can comment on it later, is that you refer to the 19th Party Congress political report, and what you suggest is an endorsement of the liberal international order. And what I see in China is the creation of a set of norms and values domestically and for a governance model domestically that is very illiberal. And so my question is really whether there is ultimately an inevitable contradiction between an increasingly illiberal domestic governance model in China, and then China being part of and continuing to benefit from a liberal international order that is run with the underpinning of which is values and norms that are just so fundamentally different than what China is doing domestically. And I think in the 21st century, that is going to be something that ultimately is not going to be viable. But we'll open up the floor. We only have about 15 minutes, and I want to give our members of our audience an opportunity. So Gil Rosman, if you'll wait for the microphone, and then we'll listen to your question. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm the editor of the Asan Forum, and I'm also the moderator of the panel tonight on sharp power, where Kim Taehwan's comments would fit very well. I understood this panel to really bifurcate into, on the one side, a charge that the West hasn't accommodated Russia and China, and on the other, a charge that China and Russia are using one tactic or another, sharp power was mentioned, to try to undermine the order in the West. I want to explore that second charge with the effort to compare what China and Russia are doing, because I think that's the thrust of what Kim Taehwan's comments were. Would we get some comments on the Chinese and Russian side as to what is suggested about their efforts to undermine this order, and are China and Russia operating very differently, or are there more similarities in what they are doing?
Do you want to direct that to anybody in particular?
Yes, China, Sasha Lukin and Feng, of course.
Okay, Sasha Lukin.
As I said, liberal international order never existed, so it cannot be undermined. Well, it was undermined by the United States. But another thing that I want to say before Professor Zhu is going to say something is that I think that his interpretation of liberal international order and the Western normative interpretation is a bit different. When you say that China wants to be part of the order, you mean economic order mainly, because of course China benefits from free trade, and it's one of the main supporters of free trade. But what I think Bonnet just said is that exactly what I meant, and this order certainly exists. At least, well, maybe it's not perfect, but it exists, and it is President Trump who wants to undermine it. But what the Westerners usually mean by it, by liberal order, is like political liberal order. And from this point of view, from, say, Russia's, or at least mine point of view, because I don't speak for Russia, it's an attempt to impose its political model on other countries, which is well, at least impossible in many cases, like we see in say, in Syria, Libya, or Iraq. And it's hard for the West to understand that it's impossible, and that's the cause of all kind of trouble. So about this order, both China and Russia say that about the economic order, about political order, we don't want to be a part of it. But about economic order, we want to be part of it, but as far as I remember, Xi Jinping said on many occasions that we don't want to destroy it and we want to be part of it, but we also want it to evolve, or to help it to evolve into a more just way, so that non-Western states are fairly represented there. Well, if you want to call it undermining, you can call it undermining, but that's not what we think about it. Thank you.
Okay, so I think if we're looking back past 4 decades, China's growth, China's re-emergence absolutely and adequately happened within the international liberal order. How many Chinese students just flooded into the US and Europe for study and learning, and how the Chinese domestic, we say, societal and political rearrangement is just, how to say, attempt to fit ourselves into the Western criteria. Where we see such a progress is really, really tremendous and dynamic. That's what we achieved. Today's some sort of power status. It's a little bit diversified from Russia's post-Cold Wars, the past taking. So then, for example, so very quickly, a couple of years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I remember what the concerns China is, Russia will totally become a Western democracy and just, how to say, become some sort of Western complex to vis-a-vis China. But such a thing never happened. The reason is, as I mentioned, it has little to do with how you just label this system, but more to do with how the power competition could just, how to say, reloot Western policy of Russia. To be honest, from the Chinese perspective, we consider America's policy of Russia is really unwise. But of course, from the Americans' perspective, you will say China's policy of Japan and ASEAN really go very stupid because China makes Japan become China's enemy. Yes, it's the real story of international politics. So I don't think any comparison between China and Russia will just, how to say, narrow down to some sort of the case. China is more welcome or more receptive, or Russia is different. But my view is that some sort of such a China-Russia's the input to this liberal international order is mostly depends on action and a reaction cycle. For example, Taiwan issue, I think it risks a lot if the US really, really squeezing the China into the corner, then Beijing will erupt. Then we will see some sort of a traditional course very well, just how to say, on the huge jeopardy. So then my view is this. Yeah, liberal international order is always a beacon for China's future. But the problem is...
You just wait when they do to you what they did to us in Ukraine. Let's see what you do then. How you
Yes, it's a Taiwan is similar to China as the Ukraine probably implicates to Russia.
Say in China, South China.
I can think of more differences than similarities on that score. I think we're going to take another question. Any other questions from the audience? Yes? Woman back here.
Well, thank you very much for this amazing panel. We really see divergences developing in a clear manner.
All over the map, really, yes.
Yeah. So what I see, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I see two speakers advocating for the development of a post-Western order. And Feng, as you know, Xi Jinping proposed, in that line, he proposed a new security architecture in Asia that would not be based on any alliance system. So I wonder what is Russia's position on this? A post-alliance, post-Western architecture in Asia, security architecture in Asia, which was proposed by Xi Jinping.
Well, Russia supports a new security architecture in Asia, but the idea is not to create any new organization, like OSCE, for example, but to base it on the existing organizations, such as ASEAN, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and others, and some, because it's not very reasonable to expect that a new organization should be created. So that's why Russia actively participates in all this around ASEAN, ASEM, and all the security groups around ASEAN, and also in, some other groups. So that's the basic position, but it doesn't work very well, because some people want to create divisions again. The whole idea of so-called Indo-Pacific cooperation is, we see it as anti-Chinese, or more than anti-Russian, but basically anti-Chinese. So we hope it's not going to happen, but that's the policy of the West and its allies.
Any other questions? All right, well, I will pose one of my own, since we have a few minutes left. We heard earlier this morning that the Russia-China relationship is more of a marriage of convenience, not a new term. I think there's a book by that name by Bobolov, if I'm not mistaken. And so there's been this discussion here about whether Russia and China are working either together or separately to undermine the liberal international order, if they're doing this in similar ways. And so my question is really, Sasha, you seem to suggest that there's a lot of convergence between China and Russia in their approaches to the international order, the way they work in the UN across a range of issues. But do you think that there is sufficient convergence that if there is to be a new order that is going to be forged, that Russia and China have sufficient convergence of interest to support this? Or is there an inevitable tension between the two countries, as China is very much a rising power, I would say has fairly great ambition, certainly in the region, perhaps beyond, as someone else said this morning, and maybe even at Russia's expense?
Is it
you can,
for me? Yes.
Sure.
Well, I've just happened to publish a book on Russian-Chinese relations where I criticize my good friend Bobolov's ideas, that it's a marriage of convenience, and I show in detail how this convergence, very deep convergence of worldviews and interests came about from the 1990s until today. And yes, I think that our Russian-Chinese cooperation is based on the geopolitical realities and is objective. We can see it from the fact that it began already in late Soviet time, and many leaders changed, both in Russia and China from that time. Well, in Russia not that many, but some changed. So, as I said, we have similar ideas on most international problems. In economic cooperation, we have some usual problems, but this is not the main base of our cooperation. I think the main base is China is a rising power. It is true, but it is not. It is a challenge, like an economic challenge to Russia. Of course, if it's continue growing fast, which is not necessarily going to happen. I remember in 1970s, Ezra Vogel wrote a book, Japan is #1, and then Japan stagnated for a long time. So you never know what happens in China, but if this tendency continues, it's going to, but this is a good challenge. We need to somehow do something ourselves in our internal politics. I was not discussing internal politics because my Georgian colleague knows it's better probably than me, so, and he discussed everything. But I only talked about international relations. But also a second factor is that that you are helping a lot. The West is helping a lot. I mean, the whole idea of pressurizing Russia and China at the same time would have been thought crazy by realists like Henry Kissinger or even Brzezinski. Even you don't have to be a pro-Russian idiot to understand that, because they have always tried to use either Russia against China or China against Russia. But now they try to attack us at the same time. I think this is, but this is because Western politics is becoming based on ideologies. Like when I talk to my American colleagues now, sometimes I have a feeling that I'm talking to a party secretary in the Soviet Union. They just don't understand such things, reasonable things. So. So these are two factors, an objective factor, but also a subjective factor that helps us a lot. Well,
Final word, Feng, you wanted to add something?
I just have one point to add. I think, yes, China-Russia relations usually is a little bit tricky because some sort of, we say, such a very lengthy border areas, then some sort of history-based, such a inherent vigilance vis-a-vis each other. But I think that things really dramatically changed in recent years for two factors. One is, I think Russia and China really feel a lot of impel or incentive we needed to gunning up vis-a-vis Americans' dominance. I think such things really make a lot of sense, sweeping across China and Russia. The second, I think two leaders, Xi Jinping and Putin, they have a lot of similarity. They really have a chemistry. So probably Chinese will believe that Xi now will be next to Putin. Putin could be next to Xi Jinping. But whatever it is, then we will see some sort of such a leadership-based chemistry is really, it seems to me, is increasing.
Great. This has been a fascinating discussion and a very good diversity of views. Please join me in thanking our panelists.